That day, Jeffrey woke up earlier than usual. In order not to wake up his wife, April, the man made his way to the kitchen, where he made himself a cup of coffee. Since he had the day off, he decided to go to the auto shop in order to buy a spare part for his Ford. The man loved his battered car, which had recently become the only way he could distract himself from his sad thoughts. After drinking his coffee, Jeffrey got dressed up and went to the store. Immersed in his anxious thoughts, Jeffrey slowly walked down the street, nodding from time to time to his acquaintances, whom he greeted as they walked by. The weather was warm, which couldn't help but fill the man's heart with optimism. Jeffrey had about half a mile to go when he saw a rather heartwarming scene. It played out on the porch of a house on Park Street. The young woman was desperately trying to get the stroller up the front steps, but the wheels simply couldn't handle the steep climb. The situation was complicated by the fact that there was a little girl in the stroller who didn't look older than 1 year old. Having witnessed a series of the woman's unsuccessful attempts to get the stroller to the door, Jeffrey felt guilty and hurried to help the woman. "Good morning, ma'am. Let me help you. It's too heavy for you to lift," the man said and picked up the stroller. "Oh, thank you very much. If it weren't for you, I'd still be at it for half an hour later," the woman answered, opening the front door. Jeffrey carried the stroller into the living room and placed it carefully on the floor. He did it so skillfully that the baby lying in it didn't feel a thing. Jeffrey was about to say goodbye to the young woman and leave, when suddenly he saw a small cross on the baby's chest, which, for some reason, stuck out from the baby's onesie. The characteristic metallic sheen made the man immediately realize that the piece of jewelry was made of silver. But that wasn't what surprised Jeffrey. The thing was that the man had already seen this cross before. Jeffrey's wife personally put it on their newborn daughter. And it wouldn't have been that big of a deal if their baby hadn't died exactly a week ago. The baby was so weak that she didn't live long after being born. The doctors did everything they could, but little Kate could not be saved. The pregnancy wasn't particularly difficult. April didn't feel worse than most women carrying a child. For the first couple of months, the woman was haunted by morning sickness and dizziness. But then the unpleasant symptoms went away, and April started feeling much better. Unfortunately, April's health deteriorated a month before she expected the delivery date. When the woman came to the hospital, the obstetrician on call immediately determined that she was having contractions. Since Kate was born prematurely, her condition remained critical throughout the week. Losing their daughter was extremely painful for both Jeffrey and April. The young parents couldn't pull themselves together and find the strength to return to normal life, even though they knew full well that not a single force in the world could bring their daughter back. And now, looking at the baby sitting in the stroller, Jeffrey couldn't take his eyes off the cross, which was the exact copy of the one April had given her daughter. The voice of the baby's mother pulled Jeffrey out of his thoughts. "Is something wrong? Why aren't you looking at Molly like that?" Jeffrey shuddered and turned to the baby's mother. Having pulled himself together, he said, "No, everything is fine. But this cross, it is of such an unusual shape. I feel like I've seen it before." "Oh, it's a long story. I don't think you want to listen to it," the woman replied. But that answer clearly wasn't what Jeffrey was looking for. He actually did want to hear the long story of that particular cross. As it turned out, the woman's name was Sarah Young, and she was raising her daughter alone. Trying to get Sarah to talk about the cross, the man casually invited her to come over to have dinner with their family. "Trust me, my wife April and I will be very happy to have you over," Jeffrey added. Sarah hesitated for a moment, but seeing the sincerity in the eyes of her guest, she was happy to accept. Jeffrey thanked the woman and went home. The man decided against continuing his trip to the shop. He was too eager to share the news with his wife as soon as possible. "Can you imagine? I just saw the same cross that you put on our little Kate," Jeffrey announced right from the doorway. April looked doubtfully at her husband and shook her head. "I don't think it could have been the same cross. "You know that I grew up in an orphanage. The caregiver said that I had it on me from the first days of my life. That was why I passed it along to my daughter. Too bad that it didn't do her any good." As expected, the words of his wife didn't convince Jeffrey that he was mistaken. The man had an excellent memory, and he knew that he couldn't have been wrong. Looking forward to the evening, Jeffrey sincerely hoped that Sarah would clarify the situation. By the time the young mother arrived, the man was on pins and needles. April immediately liked Sarah and her daughter, Molly. But when she saw the cross on the baby's neck during dinner, her surprise knew no bounds. "God, Jeffrey was right. It really is exactly like the one I gave Kate." April threw up her hands. Sarah looked at the surprised spouses and realized that it was time to tell everything she knew about that little thing. Much to April's and Jeffrey's dismay, the woman's story failed to clarify what was happening. As it turned out, Sarah was an adopted daughter and didn't know her biological parents. Just like April, she had that cross since the day she was born. The age difference between the two women was only 2 years, so they could basically be considered to be the same age. Sarah's adoptive parents didn't know her mother personally, and therefore the origin of the cross was also unknown. And when April took Molly in her arms, she saw the number 2 was engraved on the back of the cross. But the cross she had the number 1 engraved on it. "What's going on? Are there more crosses like this?" April whispered, wrinkling her forehead. Realizing that there was something very mysterious about this situation, all 3 of them decided that they needed to solve this mystery. "I think we need to hire a private investigator to get to the bottom of this story," Jeffrey suggested, choosing not to postpone dealing with this issue. Sarah and April nodded their heads in agreement, feeling that Jeffrey was right. The next day, Jeffrey took little Molly's cross and went to see a private detective. In the depths of his soul, the man wasn't sure if his idea would end up being successful, but he simply couldn't think of any other way to shed light on the secret. Having listened to Jeffrey's confusing story, the private detective took out a camera from his desk drawer and took several pictures of the cross. The man used to be a police officer in the past and knew how to properly conduct an investigation. At parting, Bill Rogers shook hands with the client and asked him to come back in a week. During the week, Jeffrey, Sarah, and April couldn't help but feel very nervous and agitated. The week seemed to drag on forever, and when it finally came to an end, the 3 of them went to see the detective and even brought Molly along. They were happy to learn that Bill had gotten to the bottom of their situation. Bill Rogers began his speech by telling Sarah and April that they were sisters. Needless to say, his words made quite an impression on the young women. "What do you mean, sisters? How is that possible?" April exclaimed. But as it turned out a little later, Bill had irrefutable evidence to prove his words. Thanks to the information the private detective managed to collect, the women learned that their birth mother's name was Samantha Harris. She grew up in a poor family and got married to a man named Larry White as soon as she came of age. Unfortunately, Samantha's husband was a criminal, and a year and a half after the birth of Sarah's eldest daughter, he ended up in prison. The situation was aggravated by the fact that Samantha was already pregnant with her second child at the time. Despite the fact that it wasn't Samantha's first pregnancy, the woman couldn't have a natural birth, and the doctors had to do a C-section. Unfortunately, Samantha ended up having internal bleeding, and the doctors understood that her chances of recovery were slim to none. Having given birth to her second daughter, the woman only had time to give her the cross that her father made her in prison. Larry was an excellent self-taught jeweler who could turn any piece of precious metal into a work of art. It was Larry who sneaked 2 crosses into his wife's pocket during her last visit to prison. Thus, Sarah and April got silver crosses made by their father. 3 days after the birth of her second daughter, Samantha passed away. A week later, her daughters ended up in an orphanage. But 2-year-old Sarah was fortunate. She was soon adopted by new parents who gave their adopted daughter their last name. But April ended up living at the orphanage until she reached the age of maturity. Perhaps if Larry hadn't been a criminal serving a 10-year sentence from robbery, his daughters could have stayed with him. But he was a criminal, and so the social services had no choice but to send the girls to an orphanage. When Bill had finally finished speaking, a tense silence filled the office. Jeffrey was the one to break the silence. And what happened to April and Sarah's father? As if anticipating this question, Bill smiled and delivered the truly amazing news. The fact was that Larry White had served his term in full and was currently living in a shelter for disabled people. He received a spinal injury during his time in prison, which had always been considered an extremely dangerous place. If you'd like, you can even visit Larry. He decided to change his life for the better and get off the criminal path for good, the detective said before they left. Jeffrey thanked the detective for his help and paid him way over the amount they agreed on. Meanwhile, April and Sarah went outside and called each other sisters for the first time in their lives. Without even discussing it, they immediately told Jeffrey that they wanted to visit their father, whom they had never seen. Jumping ahead, I'd like to say that the sisters didn't back out of their decision and went to see their father the very next day. Seeing two young women in the visiting room, Larry understood everything without words. Tears welled up in the eyes of the ex-con, and his lips started trembling treacherously. Hugging their wheelchair-bound father, April and Sarah felt like the family they once were over 20 years ago. Watching the sisters, Jeffrey knew from then on their lives would be completely different. The man was also 100% sure that if heaven did exist, Samantha was now looking at her family from up there and sending them her prayers.